right, so I'm going to check and make sure this is working. Let's see. Go to my channel. Make sure. Okay, we are live. Okay. So last time we talked about, and today's class will be short because I'm going to give you class time to finish up working on your product issue in your groups, if you have groups, and then to start working on the next critical thinking challenge, which you'll have Thursday, to do the pricing critical thinking challenge. I'm going to try and get that up as soon as I get out of here today, as soon as we leave class today, get that up to give you more time because it's a more complex issue with regard to the pricing models. So with regard to ethics and pricing, pricing is where all the other decisions come together in marketing. So it's one of the most critical factors because ultimately, if the price is not right, and price doesn't necessarily have to be money, it can be other things, intangible things. So we'll talk about how this applies to your life in just a second. If it's not right, the transaction doesn't occur and marketing fails. It doesn't take place. So it's critical in that all of the other elements of marketing, we organize marketing around 4 Ps: product, price, place, and promotion. They all come together in price. Now, having said that, with regard to things like product development, and what we focused in on in this class in the last time was the ethical issues of product development and not as much of the ways that we can come to developing products in a theoretical way, right? And there is a very good theory about the way you should bring products and services to market to ensure that they don't fail. The vast majority of products and services that are brought to market fail for lack of a well-defined protocol. So we know, even with a well-defined protocol, the chances of a product or service failing may be fairly high, but the reason a lot of products fail is because businesses engage in giving out products or developing products that maybe people don't want or don't need, because we have a tendency to, as human beings, project our hopes and desires on the rest of the world. And I think I told you all an example of this, which was I used to work with a woman. We had kind of a little consulting company, and one of our clients was a major fast food retailer here in Oklahoma, founded here in Oklahoma, called Sonic. You all have heard of Sonic. And we were testing products for them, and she had this contract, and I was helping her with the contract, and we tested these products, and she went and presented this to the CEO of Sonic, who at the time his name was Cliff Hudson, and he was a lawyer, which I admire lawyers. I generally like lawyers. But out of the blue, he comes up with, I don't remember what his exact response was, but we tested this new drink product. And the thing that makes Sonic sort of unique is because it has such a limited space in terms of their production facilities at each of these Sonics, that almost everything has to be a combination of stuff that they already have, or something has to go on their menu. So if they want to bring in something that's completely new and is not sort of a combination of stuff that they already have, something may have to go because Sonic's, the biggest portion of their space is not taken up by actual inside space and kitchen and storage. It's taken up by places to park your car and have a car hop come out. So they have very limited space. And she had gone through these testing, and we tested the products actually in my classes here at UCF. And his response was, you know what I think we ought to do? Margarita cherry slush. And her response was, why would you think that? Well, I don't know. I like margaritas and cherries, and that sounds like a good idea to me. Cliff Hudson at the time was in his late 50s, and he was a white male. If you had to guess, who do you think? He's also the one who loved. Do you guys remember the Sonic commercials? You probably don't. These are really old now. I'm really dating myself again. The Sonic commercials with the two guys. Do you all remember the two guys commercials? I hated those commercials. I hated the two guys. I thought they were obnoxious. And I don't know why. And he kept insisting that the two guys, you have to have the two guys. They're the reason that we're so. Those were two dorky, middle-aged, white males. That is not the demographic that goes to Sonic. Who goes to Sonic? Anybody want to guess what the demographic that goes to Sonic at the time was?
Probably younger.
You're correct. Younger. Why do you think younger?
Just because I just remember in high school, like people would go to Sonic for lunch or whatever, meet up with their friends, and
Right.
get drinks.
It's a place you can sit. They had cheap drinks at lunch or at the happy hour specials or whatever they did for lunch. So you're correct. One of the big demographics was younger people. What's the second demographic of people that go to Sonic? Anybody want to guess?
Stay-at-home moms.
You're absolutely correct. That is soccer moms. That is the second demographic. People who are like, they go through Sonic twice a day, some of them at the time. Now, nobody does this anymore because we've all got DoorDash and we order everything to be delivered. Why would you want to go to your house? Don't need to do that. That's crazy. But yes, it was soccer moms and young people. Cliff Hudson was a middle-aged, well, actually not middle-aged. The average life expectancy of males in the United States is 72 years old. That means middle age is 35. So you all are approaching that, right? I'm just kidding. But think about that. 35 is middle-aged. 50, 59 or whatever he was at the time is not middle-aged, it's old. It's young old, whatever you want to call it. Margarita cherry slush is not what a soccer mom wants. I can almost guarantee it. You know? And it's not what a teenager wants. What do they want? I don't know, but not that. And that's not what we had tested. And we had tested it out here at college because you're closer to the age of the target market than he was, right? You're still not the prime target market, but you're closer to that age than he was. So we have, with regard to products, a well-developed sort of theory about the way you bring things to market, which is, first of all, you listen to people, you listen to customers, you decide what it is that's needed out there based on what your customers are saying. Your sales force is a big part of this. You develop a very detailed projection as to what it's going to cost you to develop the product and whether or not you have the capabilities of developing this product. The company I worked for was a publicly traded company, and we had this problem with our CEO who kept telling, so I was the attorney for this company, and I had to respond to these RFPs from a legal perspective and make sure that all the I's and T's were dotted because we sold to school districts, which are governmental entities. And when you deal with a governmental entity, you certify that the stuff that you are submitting to them is true and accurate and correct. And I remember telling Jeff, I went into his office, I'm like, Jeff, we don't have all of this stuff. He's like, he used an expletive that started with F. I was like, we don't have these titles. F the numbers live on the edge. And my response was, Jeff, I'm not putting my law license on the line and facing a possible perjury charge. He's like, we'll get them by the time that we fulfill the order. No, don't do that. Determine whether or not you can actually bring the product to market within the resources that you have, which means having a budget, allocating resources, developing it, testing that product out, right? So there's these steps that you go through in the protocol to determine or to ensure that you have a better shot at success with product development. Now, what we focused on mostly last time was not the marketing theory part of this. We focused on the ethical theory part of it, which is we went from let the buyer beware to a system of strict products liability where if you manufacture something and people are hurt by it, you may be held liable, strictly liable. And I asked you what the justification for that was. And with regard to negligence, the ethical justification is pretty easy to see. It's in the elements of the theory, of the legal theory. It's in the element. It's duty. You have a duty to manufacture things in a reasonably safe and prudent manner. And then we talked about diethylstilbestrol, and we talked about Willie Searcy and Ford manufacturing Ford F-150, the most popular selling truck in America. And we did talk about Searcy, right? I talked about the Searcy case last time, didn't I?
I don't think so.
So Willie Searcy is riding, I'm pretty sure I talked about this, but maybe not. Willie Searcy is riding in the front seat of his stepfather's Ford F-150 pickup when he drops something on the floor and his stepdad tells him to pick it up. He is going forward at the time, so he is putting pressure on the chest restraint at a rate at the point in time that his father slams into the back of another car, and he goes slamming. The seatbelt, the lap belt keeps him in place because the lap belt doesn't move, right? Once you plug it in, once you connect it. But the shoulder harness does, unless it experiences a sudden increase in pressure. Because he was going forward, he slams into the dashboard and windshield, manages to break most of the bones in his face, and snap his neck, and he becomes a quadriplegic. Now, at the time Ford designs this, they designed it using engineers who said this is safe. Like, it's a freak accident. Who would think that that would be something that would happen? This is like a 1 in a billion possibility. But we're still going to hold Ford liable, which, by the way, Ford managed to get off the hook as a result of a justice named Prissy Owen, who was on the Texas Supreme Court at the time. And she wrote an opinion that screwed the Searcy family. They were awarded millions of dollars in damages. And I said, well, what theory is it that we can use to justify, what ethical theory is that we can use to justify strict products liability? Because Ford's not really at fault. They designed this in a reasonably prudent and safe way within the limits of the scientific knowledge that was available at the time. The same way that diethylstilbestrol was developed and tested within the limits of the knowledge that was available at the time. And yet we're going to hold them liable, strictly liable. Doesn't matter that you were reasonably prudent, that you were a reasonable. Now, in theory, you've never met the reasonable person. With regard to negligence and duty, you've never met this person. This person doesn't exist. What is the reasonably prudent person? How did you all get here today? You got in a car and you drove here, right? To get here. What'd you do when you got in your car? You put the seat, that's the first thing. You got in the car and put the seatbelt on. You think that's the first thing you should have done?
You close the door, put the seatbelt, and
You think that's reasonably prudent? You're a walking disaster waiting to happen. Right there with that answer. Walking disaster. And the reason I know this is because I have a commercial pilot's license, right? And I fly competitive aerobatics. And before you take off in an airplane, you go through what's called a pre-flight checklist, where you go through the airplane in a meticulously systematic order and check and make sure that everything's working. Because when you get up in the air, there is no pulling over. The reasonably prudent person, before you got in that car, would have checked the tire pressure. The number one reason for blowouts is improperly inflated tires. So did you do that? Did you check? You've never met the reasonably prudent person. The reasonably prudent person is a objective standard by which we judge. Now, Ford is probably within that standard because they used engineers to come up with this. And yet we're gonna hold them strictly liable. The theory that supports that is purely economic, and it's also purely in ethical terms based on a capitalistic understanding of utilitarianism. Who's in the better position to pay, Ford or Willie Searcy, who's now in a hospital bed for the rest of his life? The estimates at the time were that it would cost $12 million to keep him alive, because he had to have round-the-clock, 24-hour-a-day constant supervision of people watching his ventilator to make sure that it didn't go off and cleaning it and making sure that it wasn't clogged. Strictly utilitarian, right? Now, all of this is to say, to go back through what we talked about in terms of products, there's this protocol that we've developed and a theory behind what we're doing that involves bringing a product to market in a certain way that allows for the maximization of potential of success. And yet, companies and products fail because of people like Cliff Hudson, who decide that he wants margarita cherry slush. And that's not what we tested, because he's projecting what his, old white preference is. White male preference. Nothing wrong with that. But that's not who your target is. Your target is high schoolers who shouldn't know about margarita at this point, right? Or shouldn't have tried it. By the way, Cliff, I don't think margarita is very good without the, tequila in it. There's a problem here. Not the target audience. With regard to pricing, though, from a marketing theory perspective, there's no unifying theory. We have theories that sort of unify pricing or product development. Next time we'll talk about advertising, and we'll have theories that unify advertising and promotion, the promotion element. No theory with regard to marketing theory on price. The price has to be right. But the way you arrive at that right price depends on the objectives of the company, which in many instances may be survival. So there's ways that you price things: cost plus, return on investment. These are all short-term sort of pricing models. So how do we price products? What is the pricing model that we should use for products? Well, other than the price has to be right, there's no unifying theory as to how we arrive at what the right price is. If, for example, you're a nonprofit, your goal in pricing of services, is donations, basically. It's not based on, if you're the Red Cross, making a profit. If you're Ford, it's based on making a profit. Now, how do you maximize that profit? Well, should you engage in social entrepreneurship, things like that? So there's no unifying theory with regard to price, which means it's very, very unusual in the fact that of the 4 Ps, we have no unifying theory in marketing. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have theories about ethics that apply to pricing models, right? So ethics and pricing in marketing. One of the things that we face as a capitalistic country is free market principles. And we hold these near and dear. And the idea is that if I have something, I should be able to price it. If I own property, from a legal theory, I own it, I should be able to price it at the price that I want. Property in Anglo-American law is sacred. It's my right. If I can sell you a gallon of milk for $100, which it may get to $100, rapidamente, I should be able to do that, right? But is that ethical? Well, a lot of it depends on context and specifics. Looking at the totality of the circumstances. There's a big difference between pricing, what we think of forever and ever and ever until recently, as something that was sort of necessary and a staple. Now, probably modern science is suggesting that it shouldn't be. Milk, for example, I'm using milk as my example, and pricing a Rolex. And there's different sorts of circumstances that apply to the ethics of a Rolex versus a gallon of milk. Historically, we thought milk was pretty important. They took out whole ads years ago, even up to about 15 years ago, there were billboards all over the interstate that said milk, it does a body good. Why? Because milk has calcium. It turns out that it's really hard for the body to absorb calcium after the weaning through milk. Like you need to get calcium from other things probably. So under free market theory, I should be able to price my gallon of milk at whatever I want. Now, what if there's a hurricane that comes through? Should I be able to jack the prices of my groceries, say milk, in a crisis situation up to the point where people, I will tell you that in hurricane situations, if you have something on the shelves, people would probably pay $100 a gallon for milk. If there's a very limited food supply because they can't get through and you have a convenience store and you've got milk, you could probably start selling those pints of milk, or if you're a grocery store that survives the hurricane for $100, should you be able to do that in that situation? What's that called? Well, that's called price gouging. And even in a capitalistic society, we have laws against this. We have laws that say, don't do that. Don't engage in price gouging. You see it most in things like hurricanes, not with milk, but with supplies like lumber. Because what happens when a hurricane starts to form in the Atlantic and starts to threaten the coast of Florida, for example? Well, everybody runs out and they need to buy what? Plywood and 2x4s to secure their property, to avoid damage to windows and structures. Should you be able to start selling that plywood at hundreds of dollars a sheet versus the average price? Well, that's price gouging, right? That's illegal. And what's the theory that we say that we're infringing on your property right when we have these laws that say don't do that? And what theory is it that we're using to do that from an ethical standpoint? Well, we can use two. Actually, we can use all three. We can use virtue ethics. We can use duty ethics, which just says, yeah, you have a property right, but there are limits to property rights. And duty imposes on you an obligation to not do this, to not take advantage of these kinds of situations. In these kinds of issues, it's pretty easy. Price fixing is another one. So forever and ever and ever, until recently, in Stillwater, there were sort of two guys that owned all of the gas stations in the Stillwater area. And gas prices in Stillwater were always higher than in the rest of the state. Now, gas prices in Oklahoma are generally lower than a lot of places in the nation. Why? Because we do what? We produce a lot of gas. If you go to Love's, they will, it's not gas, it's fuel. They sell fuel, they don't sell gas. They sell fuel. But we produce a lot of fuel in this state. But it was always higher in Stillwater. Why? Well, they kind of have a captive audience. If you think about Stillwater, it's unique in the state in that it's got a fairly high per capita income. Why? Because it's got a university there. So you've got a lot of college professors. It's way away from I-35. It's about 15 miles from I-35. It's, an hour and a half from Oklahoma City. So it was sort of uniquely situated it's about 45 minutes to Tulsa, and people are not gonna drive 45 minutes to get gas. So they could price fix. This is also illegal. Again, what theory would, well, duty, we can say, yes, we recognize that, so it's my property, I have a right to control it, I have a right to pass out the ducks the way I want to, but there's limits on property rights. What is property? Technically, what is property?
Ownership?
Well, what defines ownership? How can you own something? How can you own something? Is your cocaína property? Yeah.
I was gonna say, have things completely paid off like a house or a car.
Okay, so you have the ability to pay it off or sell it, right? Do you pay if you are a user, which you shouldn't, of illicit drugs? Do you pay for that? Is it property?
I think no, because it's a service.
It's a tangible thing, it's not a service. Although services scholars would argue that all products are services. Services scholars, like Mary Jo Bittner, would say that all products are services because you don't value the thing in and of itself. You're not like Gollum in The Lord of the Rings with my precious, right? He loves the ring for itself to the point that it becomes destructive to him, right? You all have watched The Lord of the Rings. You know who Gollum is, right? My precious. He's got this. He values that thing. So services scholars would say all products are services because unlike Gollum, there's nothing that we value for the thing in and of itself. Why do we all value it for a service? Can services be property?
Intellectual property.
They can be intellectual property, that's correct. That's right, yes. They can be intellectual property. So some of the things that we might think of as being property are, and some of the things that we think of as being property are not property. Why is your illicit drug, technically speaking, in the United States? Now, this is a very gray area. Right now, it's changing because a lot of states have gone to the legalization of the marijuana, right? Oklahoma has made medical marijuana legal, but it's not legal at the federal level, which creates a lot of problems. From a banking perspective, because it's technically not property from a federal level, which means that the people who are selling it can't take these proceeds and go deposit them in a bank. Because the bank doesn't want your dirty money. Coming up with ways around this, but it's technically not property. Why is it not property? Well, again, things that we might think of as being property that are not are things like drugs. It's tangible, people use it, they pay money for it, but it isn't legally alienable, divisible, or descendable. A, D, and D. These are the characteristics of property. It is alienable, divisible, or descendable. What does that mean? Well, you can, during your lifetime, dispose of it as you want. Can you get rid of your cocaine the way you want to? Legally, no. Do people do it? Yes. Legally, no. If you're selling that product, and I used to practice criminal law, you can't sue your customer. Bless you.
Thank you.
You can't sue your customer if they take the cocaine and don't pay you in court and it's not legal. It's not property. Is your body property? Years ago, when the internet was first getting going, there was a college student who was going to sell his virginity online. Is your virginity property? No. That's illegal in most states. I think it may still be legal in Nevada. But prostitution is illegal, so it's not your property. Your body is not your property. You can't will your body. There's only certain ways that you can dispose of your body. Your organs are not your property. You are not property. Can't be sold. That's creepy. Can't be stuffed and set up in the corner like Juan Perón did with Evita. Took her all over Europe. Right? Can't do that. No, not property. Some of the things that we don't think of as you suggested, intellectual property, a lot of people don't think of that as being, it's property. Now it expires. It has limits. Intellectual property patents, for example, on drugs have limits to how long you can enforce those property rights. The only thing that doesn't terminate with regard to intellectual property and property rights are things like trademarks. They can be extinguished. How can trademarks be extinguished? Well, they can be extinguished by your product becoming generic for a category of things, and you lose the trademark on it. Which is why, people like insist that, Kleenex, for example, they don't want it to become synonymous for facial tissue. Xerox used to do this whole ad about you can't Xerox a Xerox on a Xerox, but you can make a copier. You can't make a copy on one of our copiers. They did not. People, when I was a kid growing up, Xerox was the major corporation that produced these photocopiers, which I was fascinated for years and years and years by these things because they're just fascinating. You put this down on a piece of glass and it comes out exactly like the original, right? To some extent. Xerox did not want to become, because they could lose their trademark, which is a piece of intellectual property. So it's alienable. You can get rid of it during your lifetime. You can sell it. You can abandon it, and somebody else can find it and pick it up if you abandon it, and it becomes their property. No amount of your abandonment of your cocaine makes it somebody else's property. Can't do that. It's not alienable. Divisible is I can say at my death what happens. I can't say what happens to my body at my death. I can't sell my body. I can't tell you what happens. I can say I can make certain requests that are permissible under the law, but it's not property. Can't sell my body. I can say I want to be cremated. You generally have to kind of listen to that. Although if your people that survive you don't listen to you, it's kind of hard to enforce it. I worked with two people, or worked with one guy. He was a professor here until very recently, and he and his wife and my mother and I all went on a trip, and he was out at 4 a.m. bicycling, and I said, "What are you doing, Bob? It's vacation." I gotta outlive Donna, because if I don't outlive Donna, she's gonna cremate me, and I have a grave, and we're both going in the grave. And she came out and said, "No, I'm not going in the grave. I'm gonna be cremated. My ass, you're going in the grave." So you can say what's going to happen to that property at your death, your house, your car, your clothes. You can say how that's going to be devised, or it's descendable, which means that if you don't say how this is going to go, the court will tell you how it's going to go through an intestate statute. Every state has them. They're all different. In Oklahoma, our intestate statute is per stirpes, by the roots, which lists, if I don't have a will, which most people die without will, they die intestate, the court's going to say who gets my stuff. The court can't say who gets your cocaine. They can't say who gets your body parts, right? There's limited, again, and it's not property. You can, at your death, if you are, die in a hospital, you can say, I'm an organ donor. That's okay. But it's technically not property, right? So when we think about the pricing of these kinds of things, the price has to be right. And although that's our property, we have these property rights, which we hold to be sacred in capitalistic countries like the United States. There are limits to those. And these limits are predicated on what we believe is ethical. And we've codified these limits in the law. So price fixing, the fixing of fuel prices among these two people that owned all the fuel stations in Stillwater. They'd get together every Monday and have breakfast at a restaurant. Everybody knew this when my brother was in college up there. And magically the prices would be the same at all the pumps in Stillwater. That's price fixing. Price gouging, predatory pricing. What is predatory pricing and why is this bad? Well, predatory pricing involves going after vulnerable populations. And it was most clearly seen in an example called the subprime mortgage crisis, which almost created it did create a huge financial crisis worldwide, but it wasn't as bad as it really could have been, where they were going in. It used to be that if you wanted to buy a home, if you wanted to have a 30-year mortgage, you had to verify that you could pay that mortgage off. And how did you do that? Well, literally, it was called a fully documented loan. These rules were set down by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which required that banks fully document the loans. What is a fully documented loan? When my parents, I haven't had a mortgage because I inherited my home. But when my parents bought a home and got a 30-year mortgage at the time that they did this, which has been paid off for a long time, the bank, you had to give things like your pay stubs from your work. And they would actually call your work and they would say things like, my mother's name was Rebecca. Is Rebecca going to be able to pay this back? Is she likely to be employed here 2 years? And for my mother, it was kind of hard because she was an entrepreneur and she was self-employed. So how do you verify that you've got the income to pay this back? That you're likely, well, it was through tax returns. They'd have to look at 7 years of tax. She owned a real estate company is one of the things that she owned in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And, so when she was starting out, they had to use my dad's income because he was an FBI agent. Well, which she made a lot more money than he did. And it limited the house that we could buy in the early part of her career because she was a good seller. She could sell ice to the Inuit. And she made a lot more, but it limited the amount. We got a bigger house years later after she could, verify 7 years of her income. That's a fully documented loan. They started going on stated income. You could basically say, I make whatever you could make it up. And they loan you the money because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac abandoned the rules. And it allowed predatory pricing. So people were going into these neighborhoods, particularly where there were older people, and convincing them that they could, predatory pricing occurs in things like reverse mortgages now. Take out all this money on your home and you don't have to pay it back now. Well, your heirs or assigns will have to pay it back when you die. So going after vulnerable populations. Again, we can justify these on all three grounds, on all utilitarian ethics, duty ethics, and virtue ethics. You shouldn't go after the vulnerable. So the critical thinking challenge that I will have you do for this week, that I'm going to give you some time today to start thinking about and using AI, is thinking about a necessary drug that will have a huge impact on a population in terms of curing a major life health issue? And how should we price that drug fairly? And what theory? So you're going to have to look up, using AI, I want you to look up pricing models and determine which model you should use, and then why do you justify that model and what the price should be for that drug. Using all three theories, duty, utility, and virtue, to develop an answer using AI. And then I want you to critique the AI's response to that answer. How well did it do that? I'm going to suspect that even though these large language models will produce some stuff, that the answers are going to be probably fairly superficial. So thinking about this in terms of the impact based on a totality of the circumstances, what will be a fair, ethical pricing model and price for this miraculous drug? How do we think about the totality of the circumstances? Well, this is a global perspective. What is the impact going to be in these pricing on all stakeholders, not just shareholders, not just customers, but on everybody? Revolutionary drugs have the potential to transform lives. When I was a child, I remember a time before HIV/AIDS. You all don't remember a world before HIV/AIDS. I've told you all before that the second person to die in New Mexico, that's where I grew up and lived. The second person to die of what they called at the time GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, was a tenant in one of my mother's apartments that she leased. And if you contracted at that time GRID, which we now call HIV/AIDS, it was a death sentence. If you were to contract HIV/AIDS, there are people who still die of this. But the odds of your dying of this are greatly diminished in the contemporary era as a result of the fact that we have very good treatment options. Those drugs are revolutionary. In sub-Saharan Africa, the crisis reached such a huge proportion, and those people had no ability to pay when these drugs came out. And they're protected by property rights, intellectual property rights called patents. They had no ability to pay. And so at one time, what South Africa threatened to do, if the drug companies wouldn't come down on the prices, was they threatened to become what's called a pirate nation. That means a nation that doesn't respect the intellectual property rights of other countries. Now, for a big portion of human history, who was one of the biggest pirate nations in the world? The United States. Until we became the biggest exporter of intellectual property. And then all of a sudden, we wanted to protect the intellectual property. Now, who is the biggest pirate nation now? China. Right? So I want you to think about these things and think about it from both virtue, utilitarian, and duty ethics perspectives. Any questions? All right, I will get that up so that you can start working on it in class. I'll go to my office and get that prompt up for you. And if you have any questions, I'll be here for a while to hang around. I'm going to end the stream now. And if you